Hi guys, it's Christopher Roach again with the second installment of my series on web development with Node. In the previous installment, we covered the basics of Node by playing around a bit with its REPL and creating a very simple HTTP server. In this episode, we are going to begin developing our blog engine by adding a few routes to the server we created in the previous lesson. As I mentioned in that last episode, we'll be creating the very same blog application that you've most likely seen if you've ever watched the now famous Ruby on Rails introductory video. Unlike the Ruby on Rails video, however, we'll not be putting our application together in a matter of minutes. Sexy videos that slap together an app in near impossible times are great for creating hype, but not necessarily the best mechanism for truly learning a new technology. Instead, we'll be progressing through the development of our app at a somewhat slower pace. The reason for this is that I want to walk you through the creation of the app from the lowest level possible, where we will essentially develop our own very simple set of libraries and eventually work our way all the way up to using a full-on popular web development framework. The goal here is that you'll learn how to develop an application in Node just like you would in the real world, using plenty of libraries and frameworks that abstract away much of the mundane details and allow you to concentrate solely on what's unique to your app. But you'll also develop a good understanding, at least at a very high level, of what exactly these libraries are doing behind the scenes. In essence, I hope to pull back the curtain and expose the tech behind the magic, because an engineer really needs to truly understand their tools to be as effective as possible. So let's not waste any more time talking about where we're headed. We've got a lot of ground to cover today, so let's go ahead and get right down to it. Let's begin by CDing into the blog directory that we created in the last screencast. You should have a single file in your directory called app.js, which is the simple HTTP server that we created the last time. Go ahead and open that up now in your favorite text editor and navigate to the server code that we created the last time. We're going to start out small, so let's add some code now that would check the URL being called, and if it matches a particular pattern, displays the same hello world message that we displayed last time. Otherwise, we'll issue a 404 error. To do so, we'll start off with a little refactoring. Highlight all the code that we wrote inside of the create server function last time and cut it out now. With that code, we'll create a new function that renders our new post form. So go ahead and create that function now. Call it render new post form. And we'll add some parameters so that it will take both the request and response objects that are passed into the create server function. Then paste the code that we just cut into our new function. Let's clean that up just a little bit. Once we get the routing working properly, we'll actually change this function to return some HTML rather than the current text message. But for the time being, let's just leave it as is so we can test it out and make sure that we haven't broken anything. So now go ahead and call the new function from the create server function. And remember to pass in the request and response objects as well. Save that, and we'll go ahead and test it out now to make sure that we haven't broken anything with our simple refactoring. Remember, we run the application by calling the node command and passing in the name of the app's main file, which in our case will be node space app.js. Then go ahead and copy the URL that's printed out to the command line and flip over to your browser and just pop that in, hit return, and check out that it actually didn't break anything. You can see here that we see the hello world message just as we saw at the end of our last episode, so everything seems to be working just perfectly right now. So now that we've made sure that we haven't broken anything, let's flip back over the command line, stop our app, and jump back into our text editor. Back in the create server function, we want to add a new variable which will be the regular expression representing our first route. Now, I'm not guaranteeing strict adherence to the REST protocol, especially since we will only be using the get and post methods during the course of this tutorial, but I will try my best to stick to a fairly restful set of routes given this constraint. With that in mind, let's use the URL /posts/new for our new post form, and let's go ahead and create that variable now. let's title that variable new post form regex, and we'll create an instance of a JavaScript regular expression object simply by calling new on the regexp function and passing in a string representing that regular expression. We'll begin that string with a character which basically says beginning of string, followed by /posts/new, just like we said. And now this is the interesting part, because a truly correctly formatted URL should have a trailing slash after the document file path. Now not everyone is religious about adding that slash, so we want to make sure that our regular expression object is fairly accommodating. To make sure it is, we'll add that slash followed by a question mark. The question mark basically says that the character before it is completely optional. So now we'll add a $sign to symbolize the end of the string, and we'll close up that string and close up our function call. And there we go. We've created our new regular expression object that we'll use to capture our very first route. So now that we've got a regular expression object representing our first route, we need to add some code to match that object to the incoming URLs. Before we can do so though, we need to extract the document file path from the URL. Luckily, Node comes with a library that makes that easy for us, and it's called, well, what else? The URL library. So let's go ahead and require that now. Now while I'm thinking about it, I want to mention that I'll be using the terms module and library throughout this series to represent the very same concept. Essentially, this is just a method of packaging up a set of interrelated functions and objects. Later on in the series, we'll actually discuss modules a bit more in depth, and we'll create a few of our own. But for the time being, just understand that whenever I say module or library, I mean something that you can call the require function on, and it'll pass back an object that we can set equal to a variable to allow us to gain access to the functions and objects within. So the URL module that we've just required has a function called parse that takes a URL string and returns an object representing that URL. Within that object is an attribute called pathname that we can use to get everything in the URL after the host name and up to but not including the query string. This is essentially the document file path. Once we have that file path, we can compare it to our regular expression object to see if the user has hit the new post URL. So let's go ahead and add that code now. So let's go back down to our create server function and drop down right below the last variable that we created for the regular expression object. We're going to create a new variable called pathname. Now to get that path, remember we need to call the parse method off of the URL object and pass into the URL string. We can get that URL string from the request object, so call request.url and close that up. So at this point in time we have a URL object, but we don't really need that object, so I'm not going to save it to a variable. Instead I'm just going to call .pathname directly on that to get the pathname attribute. So now we need to check that against our regular expression object. So let's go ahead and create an if statement here. And we're going to say new post form regex.test. We're going to call the test method off of our regular expression object, which returns true or false based on whether or not there's a match. So we're going to go ahead and pass in the pathname variable that we just created. And if there's a match, we want to call our render new post form function that we created previously. So let's just go ahead and drop down here and cut this out and paste it into our true clause. So now we're calling render new post form if we have a match on our URL. If we don't, however, we want to return a 404 error. So we're going to pretend like we have a function already and just call render 404. And when we want to pass into that the request and response objects, as always. And then we want to come back up here and just drop right below our last function that we created and create a new function matching the name that we just said, which in this case is render 404. And again, we'll put in the request and response parameters. And now this is going to be a pretty simple function, not like our last one was really all that difficult. But this one will have even less information, since all we really need to do whenever we call the write-head function is pass back just the number 404. We don't need to include the object with content type and everything, since all we're doing is just sending back an HTTP response and not really a web page or anything like that. So let's go ahead and call response.writehead now and pass back 404 to represent a file not found, and then call response.end to end our response. But now we are going to send back a string here, just something nice, nothing big, just something simple to be displayed in the browser, just in case this is actually seen. So we'll just type in 404 file not found. And we'll go ahead and save that and exit out of our text editor. This should be ready to go now. So let's just go ahead and fire that up, node space app.js. And let's flip back over to our browser. You already have the root URL showing up. So let's go ahead and hit return on this. You should hopefully see a 404 error now, since we don't have a route for the root URL. So let's try that out. Oh, there we go, 404, file not found. Perfect. So let's go ahead and try out our new route. So we'll put in /posts/new. We'll go ahead and try it out with the trailing slash first. Ah, there we go, hello world, lovely. So now let's go ahead and get rid of the trailing slash just to make sure that our regular expression is somewhat accommodating. Still works, excellent. So let's go ahead and just mess it up a little bit. Try something else, get rid of the new. We'll do a /in. Let's do a new, but we'll get rid of the post, or the S on the posts or whatever. So try that out. Yeah, 404, file not found. Everything seems to be working great right now. So you essentially have your very first route and your routing system. Very simple, I know. Nothing more than a simple if statement that checks one single route, but essentially you have a full web application right now. In the next part, we're going to add a new view. So let's go ahead and flip back over to our terminal now and kill the app and flip back into our text editor and go ahead and take care of adding that view. Now we could go ahead and copy our HTML for the new post form into the current file and just keep everything in one place. However, that's going to start to get real messy real fast. So at this point, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and add a bit of structure to our application. So let's actually exit back out of our text editor. And in the command line, let's create a new folder. And let's call it views, since this will, of course, be where we keep all of the views for our application. Once we created our views folder, we need to add a new file to hold the markup for our new post form. Now we could shove everything directly into the views folder, but since we're currently dealing with blog posts, and you may want to create other model objects later, such as comments, we'll go ahead and create another folder inside of views that we'll call post, and this will be where we keep all of our views specific to the blog posts. Now that we've got our views directory structure settled, let's go ahead and create a file called new.html inside of the post directory we just created. So I've got some basic HTML that I'm just going to copy and paste into this file just to keep things moving along. I've also added the same HTML to the transcript of the screencast, so you can simply copy and paste the markup over to your view as well. So let me go ahead and do that now. There we go. Let's just go ahead and save that and exit out. Now that we've created our view, we need to get it loaded into our application before we can deliver it to the user. To do that, we are going to break one of the cardinal rules of node development. We're going to perform synchronous I/O. Now, if you remember in the first screencast, I mentioned that Node's strength came from its non-blocking, event-driven nature. Unlike other types of HTTP servers that use threads for each active connection, Node performs all actions on a single thread, so it is absolutely paramount that you not block this thread by performing any synchronous actions. And for its part, Node makes this nearly impossible to do by simply not providing any synchronous functions. However, doing everything asynchronously, while an excellent idea for creating servers, is not the best way to do other things like writing scripts. And because of this, some functions have synchronous counterparts, as we will see now when we use the readFileSync function from the file system module to read in and cache our new post view. So let's go ahead and do that now by first requiring the file system module, which is actually called FS, and calling the readFileSync function found within. So let's go back over to the command line and jump back into our text editor. I'm going to call the require function again, and this time I'm going to require the FS module. Let's create a new variable that we'll call new post form HTML, and we'll set that equal to fs.readFileSync. we're going to pass into this function a string representing the location of our new.html file, which in our case will be views/post/new.html. Go ahead and save that now, and we've essentially created a global variable that'll cache the contents of our new.html file for the entire lifetime of our application. So something to take notice of here is that by default, all functions in Node are asynchronous unless otherwise specified in the name of the function. So for example, the asynchronous counterpart to the function we just called would be called simply readFile. Another thing to notice about many of Node's functions is that they tend to work with data buffers by default for performance reasons. So for instance, if we were to call the readFileSync function, just as we've done here, with only the name of the file we want to read in, we would get back a data buffer instead of a string like you might expect. I'll go ahead and demonstrate that to you now at the REPL. So let me exit out of this text editor, and I'll call Node by itself to enter the REPL. We'll call the require function again, and we'll require the fs module and just set that equal to an fs variable. I'm going to create a new variable that I'll call HTML data buffer, and I'll set it equal to fs.readFileSync, just as we did in our application, and I'll pass in the location of the file, which is views/post/new.html. So now just basically call that variable back to print out its contents. We can see here we get back a ton of hexadecimal numbers, so this is the data buffer representation of our new.html file. Not the most attractive thing to look at, so let me clear that out. And I'll go ahead and create another variable that I'll simply call HTML this time. And again, we're going to set that equal to fs.readFileSync, and we'll give the location of the file that we want to read in, which is views/post/new.html. This time though, we're going to pass in another string that basically tells readFileSync what representation we want the data returned in. So we're going to say UTF-8 because we want to basically get back a Unicode string. So call HTML variable again to see its contents. We can see now that we get back a lovely string. This is much better to look at, or much easier to look at, than the data representation that we saw just a bit ago. So with that little interlude out of the way, let's jump back into our editor and finish up our first view. Now we could go ahead and alter our readFileSync call by adding the UTF-8 encoding parameter to it, but this isn't really necessary since by default, the response sent to the browser by Node will be UTF-8. So let's leave that alone and instead concentrate on our renderNewPostForm function. We'll want to change that to return our new HTML form rather than the text we are currently returning. So first thing we'll need to do is change the content type that we are returning to be text/HTML. Otherwise, we'll continue to return plain text to the browser. So let's go ahead and change that real quick. So to be absolutely sure that the browser interprets the data just the way that we want it to, I'll go ahead and also add a charset parameter to the content type as well. So let's add that now. So that makes sure that the browser will definitely consider the text that it gets, or the data that it gets, to be UTF-8 or Unicode. So finally, the last thing that we need to do is, instead of returning the string hello world, we'll want to pass in our views variable to the response object's in functions. Let's go ahead and change that now. So we'll pass in new post form HTML, and that should return, hopefully, our HTML that we've cached in our variable. So let's go ahead and jump out of our terminal, or our text editor, and fire up our app again, and then switch back over to our browser. And I'm just going to change this to the correct URL, which is post/new. And hopefully when I hit return this time, what we'll see is our new post form showing up. Awesome. So congratulations, you've created your first route and also your very first view. So that pretty much wraps up this lesson. To recap, you've learned a bit about Node's file system module, and we've used it to read in a view file and cache it. We've covered how text is represented internally in Node as a data buffer rather than a string. And we've also created our very first view and slapped together an extremely simple routing system. Now, if you've ever developed any kind of software before, I'm sure you're already seeing all kinds of issues with the code we've written today. First off, having a separate function for each view we want to display is not a very dry way of doing things and probably won't scale very far. Also, unless you happen to like spaghetti code, having one long if statement as our entire routing system seems like a crime against humanity at the very least. Finally, our view system is not very useful right now since it is essentially nothing more than just static text. We'll soon need a full-fledged templating system if we want any type of dynamic behavior in our web pages. These are all issues that we'll be addressing in the lessons still to come, so please stay tuned and be sure to join me in the next episode. I'll see you all then.